Good morning Year 10. So today's lesson is all about global warming and the impact of change, and we're particularly thinking about how global warming and climate change impact biological systems. Before you continue with this video, can you please make sure you've completed the starter quiz, which is on Microsoft Forms. I've put a link to this in Go for Schools and also on the Teams assignment. During the video, throughout it, please make sure you take some notes, copy down any diagrams, include the labels and annotations because these are really important, particularly when you come back to your revision later on. Please also make sure you complete any questions that are set within the video. Complete them in writing, please. Pause the video if you need to in order to give yourself time to think on those questions, or if you need time to copy down diagrams, feel free to pause at any time. Once you've watched the video, please make sure you complete the Kahoot quiz to check your understanding. You can do this immediately afterwards, or you can leave it a day or two if you want to test your memory. Both are useful strategies. So let's make a start thinking about global warming and climate change, and we're thinking about the context in terms of changing carbon dioxide levels over time. So we've looked at the carbon cycle quite recently, thinking about how carbon is a molecule that can be cycled through different systems. So you find carbon in the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but you also find it in the biological molecules that make up your body. You find it in plants, and the reason that we've got it in all of these things is because different organisms can take in carbon in different forms and release it. So we've got our plants taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in photosynthesis, and they're using it to make biological molecules, and they're building their bodies out of this. And then animals will come along and eat those plants. They take that carbon that's in the body of the plant, digest it, and it becomes part of the bodies of the animal. But we also need to remember that animals and plants also release carbon dioxide. So some of that carbon in those biological molecules is going to be used in respiration. So respiration, we're using molecules from our food like sugars, and we're releasing the energy from them, but it creates carbon dioxide as a waste product. So all the time we've got plants taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and we've got plants and animals releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And we've also got microbes, so don't forget that bacteria and fungi, they are also carrying out respiration, so they're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And under normal circumstances, all of this is in balance. So we have what are called carbon sinks, which means that they are places where carbon can be stored for really long periods of time. So things like rocks, huge amounts of rock like limestone and chalk are made out of calcium carbonate. It's got carbon in it. It's a big store of carbon, keeping it out of our atmosphere. Also the oceans, carbon dioxide will dissolve in the water in the oceans, and that provides a really big store of carbon. And whilst it's in these stores, these carbon sinks, it is kind of trapped. It's going to stay there for millions of years. But what's happened recently is that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have been increasing rapidly. Now, this has basically, it's all to do with human activity. And because humans are combusting fuels, so we're burning fuels in order to release energy for driving our cars, running factories, all of these kind of things, we are really driving this increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide beyond the levels that those carbon sinks can cope with. So we've reached a point where we're releasing way more carbon dioxide than plants can take in through photosynthesis, and then can be stored in the ocean through dissolving or through creating rocks like limestone, because these processes are really long term, and suddenly we have this short term increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. So what we're going to look at today brings those ideas from the carbon cycle into the context of why it matters. Like, why should we be worried about this change in carbon dioxide? So I'm going to have a quick look at, if I can change the slide, this graph here. So this graph is showing us along the x-axis the year, so we've got a time scale, and along the y-axis it's showing CO2 levels in parts per million. So this is essentially a concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And these readings were taken from an observatory in Hawaii. And they've been taking frequent readings over decades. Now we can see on this graph a red line that goes up and down, it fluctuates, and we can see a black line that is mostly just going up. Now these fluctuations are actually seasonal variations. So within a year, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere changes depending on the season. So winter and summer, we know there are changes in terms of activity of animals and plants and things, and this affects the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the course of 1 year. So these are natural fluctuations that we get in a year, and there are also similar cycles over large timescales. So over, say, 100,000 years, we'd expect to see a natural sort of fluctuation in the carbon dioxide levels. But what hasn't been seen at any other time before now is this increase that we can see over time. So regardless of these yearly fluctuations, the overall levels are increasing, and we can see this very clearly on this line. Now the black line is showing us annual averages, so that black line is taking away the seasonal fluctuation and just showing us the average per year across this time period, and we can see a significant increase, and it appears to be an increase that is accelerating. The graph is getting steeper the further along we go. So this is a significant change, and we need to think about what effect this has on our planetary system and on the biological systems within it. So we're going to think now about what carbon dioxide actually does to our planet. So carbon dioxide is what we call a greenhouse gas. It's not alone, so methane is also a greenhouse gas. Water vapour is a greenhouse gas as well. So increased levels of any of these greenhouse gases has an impact on what we call the greenhouse effect. So I'm just going to first of all explain what the greenhouse effect actually is. And lots of people tend to get muddled up on this. I find lots of people have this idea, they come to us with this idea that the greenhouse effect is to do with the ozone layer, and it really isn't. The ozone layer has nothing to do with global warming and the greenhouse effect, so don't ever talk about the ozone layer for this. We're talking about atmospheric gases such as carbon dioxide, methane and water vapour. These are our greenhouse gases. Now we've got on here not exactly a scale diagram, but we've got the sun and we've got the earth on here, and we know that the sun produces radiation. It's in the form of light and UV, and that these travel through space to our planet. So we have this solar radiation coming into our planet, and we call this short wave. I'm just going to put SW for short, so short wave radiation. And this is things like visible light and UV. Now this shortwave radiation is able to pass through our atmosphere. It can pass through greenhouse gases without any issue, so it reaches our Earth's surface, and it will go into the atmosphere as well. And some of this, in fact quite a lot of this, will reflect away. So we get some of this shortwave radiation will reflect off things like clouds and aerosols in our atmosphere. Some of it will reflect off the surface itself. So we've got significant amounts reflecting off, but also some of that will be absorbed into the Earth's surface. And that radiation being absorbed is essentially the Earth taking in energy. And some of that energy is going to be re-emitted, and it's emitted as a long wave radiation. So I'll put long wave, LW. Essentially this is infrared, so IR for infrared. So you will have come across infrared radiation before, probably in the context of things like thermal imaging cameras and stuff. Anything that is hot emits infrared. So the Earth is taking in this energy from the sun. There's a huge amount of solar energy from the sun. The Earth is hot. It is emitting this infrared radiation out of its surface. And what happens with this is the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere actually absorb some of that. And what we find is that that long wave radiation, that energy, is essentially trapped within our atmosphere because the greenhouse gases have caused it to be absorbed. And when they absorb that energy, what's going to happen is that those gases are actually becoming at a greater temperature. Essentially, we have this increase in temperature in these gases within our atmosphere, and that causes our whole atmosphere, our whole planet, to warm up. Now, the greenhouse effect is really important to be aware of, is a natural process, and without the greenhouse effect we wouldn't have life on Earth. Without it, our temperature on Earth would be too low. It wouldn't support life. But the greenhouse effect has allowed our atmosphere to warm up, and it has allowed us to have the conditions required for life. However, because we're now increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the greenhouse effect is accelerating. We are now exceeding the sort of natural level of greenhouse effect that's needed, and we're now in a system where more and more greenhouse gases are being released. Therefore, more and more of this infrared radiation is being trapped. Essentially, we are heating everything up. So this is what global warming is. So the greenhouse effect is a natural process that causes this radiation to get trapped and absorbed and warm things up. But global warming is not really a natural process. It is a response to increased levels of greenhouse gases, meaning that things are warming up more. So that is really a physics lesson, but we need to think about the impact of this on biological systems. Now, global warming in itself only increases temperature by a very small amount, and so you'd think, well, that's insignificant, it doesn't matter. But that tiny increase in temperature, we're talking like less than a degree Celsius so far, that tiny increase in temperature has significant effects on climate. So we need to be really careful when we're thinking about climate and global warming. Climate change and global warming are really different things, but they're linked. So global warming is the overall increase in temperature of the planet. Climate change is about how that affects weather systems. And the reason we call it climate change is because that implies we can have change in all sorts of directions. Global warming is saying everything's getting warmer, but actually climate change is accepting the fact that in some regions it might not be an increase in temperature that you're feeling. It could be that you get suddenly way more winter rainfall, something like that. So the impact of global warming on climate could mean that some areas of our planet get suddenly much more rain. It could be that they get much less. So we're changing the distribution of wet and dry areas on our planet. That has a big impact for biology. It could be that we're decreasing the amount of snowfall. Now, snow is really important. We have a large part of our planet on the poles that is covered in snow and ice. And one of the things that the snow and ice does is it helps increase this process of reflecting that solar radiation. It's called the albedo effect. If you have a white surface, it reflects more light. Essentially, that's what it's doing. But if we're melting that ice through temperature change and we're reducing snowfall through climate change, there's going to be less light coloured surfaces on the planet, therefore less of that albedo effect, less reflection of that solar radiation, and that could accelerate this process because our planet is suddenly going to absorb more of the solar radiation and emit more of the infrared. So small changes can have very large effects, and we can almost have this snowball effect of what we call positive feedback, where a small change in one direction causes a bigger change in that direction, and the albedo effect is a good example of that. Other changes that we could have would be things like extreme weather conditions. So we're already quite aware globally of quite significant increases in extreme weather. We're talking things like hurricanes, big storms, really hot heat waves. So think about like Australia in their last summer, so during our winter, massive heat waves for a long period of time causing huge amounts of wildfires. So these little changes in climate can have a really big impact for species that live in those areas. So the kind of things that are going to happen as a result are changes in the actual biodiversity of these habitats. So we're going to have a think now about how these changes impact on biodiversity and why we should care. Okay, so within biological systems, climate change has the potential to create a number of changes, and this can be due to increases in temperature, changes in rain distribution, increases in wind, all sorts of things. So any change in the climate can cause changes on a habitat level. So one of the things that we experience with these changes in climate is increase in habitat loss. So there are some quite vulnerable types of habitat which can only thrive within really specific climate conditions. So these kind of habitats are really at risk. Think about the Arctic and the polar bears and seals that rely on that habitat. The ice sheets that they need in order to be able to breed and to feed and hunt are at serious risk with climate change, because one of the major things that climate change is causing is melting of the polar ice caps. Now, if we lose those ice caps, we lose the species that rely on that habitat. So habitat loss is really significant because you can't suddenly create a new space where those species are able to live. So that's one of the ways that climate change affects our biological systems. It can also cause changes in distribution of different species. So if we imagine, if we think about the UK, I think over the last decade or two, it's quite clear that our weather is changing. Our summers are becoming hotter and drier, and our winters are becoming warmer. We may also be getting more snowfall at times, but the amount of frost that we get in winter is much lower than it used to be. And these sorts of changes in weather can cause changes in the distribution. So where we find different species is changing. A lot of species are shifting geographically, so they are now found further north. For example, in Europe, there are lots of species, particularly birds and butterflies, that we're now finding further north than they ever used to be. But, I mean, you might think, well, that's great, they're managing to live in new areas. But don't forget that the areas they used to live in are now becoming uninhabitable to them. So they're moving further north, but they're also leaving the places further south. We also find that some organisms are changing their distribution seasonally. So if you think about how the weather systems change between spring, summer, autumn, winter, some organisms are able now to live through the winter in particular areas where they never would have before. Find this with things like flies and mosquitoes, but all sorts of mice and stuff as well. A lot of the things that we notice about this will be the things that are pests to us. So if you have warmer winters, you're going to have more species living through that winter rather than moving south or hibernating. So we get this change in seasonal distribution as well. But also at the other end of it, you might have some places where the summers become pretty much uninhabitable. Think about Australia and its wildfires. That's going to change the seasonal distribution of organisms in those areas. And this is particularly a problem for really vulnerable species. So species that are already in low numbers, these changes are going to make it really hard for them to survive. Another effect that we see from climate change is changes in migration patterns. So lots of species migrate during the year. They'll move between breeding grounds in the summer and overwintering grounds that are not as extreme as their breeding grounds would be in the winter. So loads of species do this, particularly birds and bats and insects, things that can fly. But you also find this in fish as well, and some mammals, particularly on large continents. So things like wildebeest in Africa are migratory species, and they're spending their whole life over a much larger geographical area than most species. So if there are changes caused by climate change in even just some parts of their areas that they normally would use in the course of a year, that's going to change their migration patterns. And we're finding some species are now migrating much further. Some are not bothering to migrate anymore. And the knock-on effects of this is, if you think about this whole idea of interdependence we talked about, within an ecosystem, every species is reliant on other species. So even just in terms of needing food, you can't exist somewhere without a food source. And if one of these migratory species is a food source for something that's native in one of those places it visits, but this migratory species stops going there, then the species that was relying on it is under threat. So changes in migration patterns can have really big knock-on effects on a whole range of ecosystems just from one organism changing its patterns. And all of these changes overall are leading to a reduction in biodiversity. So if you remember, biodiversity is about the variety of species present, but it can also mean the variety of habitats available or the genetic diversity that we have amongst species. All of these types of biodiversity are being reduced because these changes are putting species under threat, and it is reducing the numbers of a lot of species. So overall we're reducing biodiversity. Now, why should we care about that? It's not impacting humans so much. The human species is fine. We've got billions of people, so why should we care? Now, again, it comes down to this interdependence. There are lots of species that we rely on as humans, some in more obvious ways than others, so like food sources, but some in subtle ways. So there are species which we refer to as keystone species, which within an ecosystem are like the linchpin, the thing that if you removed it, everything falls apart. And these keystone species, if they're under threat, then we could have massive changes to the ecosystems themselves. And humans do rely on a lot of the services that ecosystems provide, things like the water cycle. If an ecosystem is functioning properly, we should have water cycling through in a way that is continuing to provide fresh water supplies. But if we're shifting all these systems and we're reducing the biodiversity and it's affecting the ecosystems, it might start to affect things like the amount of water available. It can also affect things like increased flooding and increased erosion of soils, and all of these things that we don't think about but will significantly impact humans. Another reason why we should care about biodiversity is a lot of our medicines that we produce come from plants or from fungi or from microbes, and we're still searching for new medicines, new treatments for cancers, all of these sort of things. But if we're reducing the biodiversity out there, we're reducing our chance of finding these things. So places like the Amazon rainforest offer an abundance of plant species that produce these chemicals which we know have potentials for drugs, but we need to do the research into them. But before we get a chance to actually research that and to find chemicals in these plants that could treat things, they might be gone. So it's really important that we maintain biodiversity for that as well. And also, just simply from a well-being sort of point of view, greater biodiversity means that there's a potential for just like greater joy in the world, really. We don't want to live in a world that has that doesn't have lions and kangaroos and polar bears and pandas and things, where the only place you can see them is in a zoo. It will impact on us in so many ways beyond the concrete. So biodiversity is really important to maintain, and climate change is having a significant effect on it already.